Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to this extra special, extra level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford. I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf medic, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, lovely random Wednesday evening, good sir?
I'm doing great. Sorry, I don't have a latte or a beer on me, but I'm ready to go. I'm ready to talk about what we're about to talk about.
For sure.
This extra episode.
And
so, yeah.
We're also joined by a very special guest, the PlayStation Drive's own, the level 99 human paladin, I think is your class, Mr. Matt Sowinski. Matt, how are you doing on this lovely Wednesday evening as well, good sir?
I'm doing absolutely swell. We're in the midst of review season. There are 100 million games to play, and this is definitely one of them.
Yep. It's definitely a game that we can be playing. So, of course, in case you're wondering, what this video is or what this, podcast that you suddenly clicked on that you're listening on, of course, this is our review discussion of Monark. This was, of course, provided to us by our friends over at NIS America. So huge thank you to them for actually supplying codes for the game for the purposes of review. And we're basically going to go through our kind of impressions with the game. All three of us have been playing it. Garret and I think, have both been playing on Switch, and I think Matt is the only one playing on PlayStation because you're playing on PlayStation 5, right, Matt?
I am playing on PS5, yes.
Cool. So you got more the 60 frames per second experience, I guess, versus
you got a working version. Got it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll get into the performance thing because I definitely think that's something important to talk about. But I think there's a lot to discuss with this game. I know that going into the release of Monarch, like all three of us, we're actually pretty excited about this game. We'd heard a lot of, good things about it, especially because a lot of the team members, for example, used to work on the Shin Megami Tensei games. Although the company that made this, who led the development, Lynn Crass, as we're going to get to a little bit later in the episode, they've been around for a while and they've done a whole bunch of stuff beyond just this. So, whereas I remember like before this was coming out, some people were talking about it as if this was like their first game or something. But they've been around since the early 2000s doing a whole bunch of other stuff. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But before we do all that, of course, if you want to support the show at home, folks, there's a number of awesome ways to do that. Number one, subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're on all the places you'll find podcasts. So check us out there. And of course, if you're on the Spotify's or the Apple Podcasts, leave us a nice little rating. Maybe, give us an Apple Podcast review. That all helps the show get discovered and be awesome. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces every week, head over to YouTube, youtube.com/YumiCapri. We put up a video version of the show every single Saturday morning, or, one-off videos like this one. If you want, like we did a whole video. I've even got like a cool background that the guys can't even see because, we don't have the technology for that. So, of course, like the video, subscribe, share with all your friends. Of course, ding, 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 ring that bell. That's the thing that people on YouTube tell you to do, ring the bell, because it certainly helps the show. And then last but not least, if you want early access to this and all of our shows, head over to patreon.com/YumiCapri. Throw a little tip in the old tip jar and out comes content. All right, time to break down Monarch and talk about this game that we've been spending some time with. So before we get into any of our surface level thoughts of the game, I figured we need to go around the table, talk about how much time we put into this game. So I'm going to start because I have the least amount to say about this because I'm actually the person with the least amount of playtime on this. I've had a lot of personal stuff kind of come up this week and I just haven't really had a lot of time to really sink into this game. So I maybe 3 or 4 hours in the game. Like I barely put a dent in it. Yeah, I basically got a little bit past where the demo ended. And then that was pretty much it. So I'm going to move on to Garret. How far are you in Monarch?
I am about 12 hours in, 12 to 13 hours in. A good amount of that is grinding though. So I couldn't really progress the story too much. To give reference to Matt over here, I'm at the Pack Bearer of Sloth level. So that's the first year building. So that's where I kind of ended around there. From this point on.
Nice. Well, and then of course we move on to Matt, who's definitely had the most time with the game. So Matt, how far are you in the game?
I'm about 26 hours in.
Cool, buddy.
The PS5 cards that are, part of the PS5 operating system says I'm about 66% of the way through. Now, granted, some asterisks to throw on there. that doesn't always include things like side content and stuff, so that might not be entirely accurate. On top of the fact that Monarch likes to jump like 14 or 15% at a time. Like it went from 50 to 66% on that completion rate. And I hit 66 quite a little bit ago. So I would guess I'm about 75% of the way through the game at about 26 hours, with a good chunk of that either being grinding or being absolutely lost.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I would imagine like that percentage probably only jumps at like very key story points. And then it jumps up probably by like a pretty large percentage, because there's probably like 9 key story points then if it's jumping by 11% every time. So yeah. That's why I'd estimate you're about that. Yeah.
I would imagine the game is probably around 40 to 45 hours if you're just kind of, if you're just doing the bare minimum amount of grinding and you're solving the puzzles at a decent clip. I would guess it's probably around 40 hours, which isn't horrible for a JRPG. There is like a how long to beat at like 82.5 hours, which I honestly don't see how. But yeah, I would estimate at around 40 hours to probably to finish.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, whenever we come into a review like this, especially a review like this one where we haven't really had enough time to finish the game, or we're going to talk about it a little bit, but I think the desire maybe to finish it is maybe not there from us. But obviously we want to be open and transparent about that. So then all of our opinions are obviously from people who haven't finished the game. But I still feel like we have a lot of valid opinions when it comes to the game, which is why we're holding this discussion as well. So let's get into it. Let's talk about our service level thoughts. So without going into too much detail, Garrett, I'm going to start with you. What are your surface level thoughts of Monarch as a whole?
So surface level, I mean, that's a good way to describe this game in general. I think it has some good ideas in there, and there's a lot of unique ideas separate from other games that are surrounding this. So if you guys don't know, Monarch is like you could say it's a turn-based tactical RPG. It has that JRPG kind of trope story with students together that's in a school building. You're trying to figure out what's going on with the school. But yeah, like overall, I just think a lot of different of the combat, the pacing of the story. Overall, it seems half baked to me, guys. Like I'm not into it. I like where it's going. I like trying to figure out this mystery behind this mist or whatever that's getting these students go all crazy or whatever. I think some of the puzzles are satisfying to go through. It's just that there was just a lot of pacing issues that slogged me down. I always felt like I was going in there. I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to go through this again. It's like an uphill battle to me. And then there's some quirks in here. I'm just like, why did you put this in here? It was mainly to me that really disrupted the game was going into this next floor where the mist is there and you have a time limit. You literally have a random time limit before a call comes up and these students are going to go right after you and you're going to have to get back out of that floor in order to like reduce your mag gate. It's just a limited time scale in that level. You don't have time to actually explore the level. And I was like, okay, let me get back out. Let me get back in and repeat, rinse and repeat. Basically. So yeah, there's just some design levels that I didn't really care for. I liked turn-based RPGs. I think this was a fine, serviceable combat game. Some of the level design was a little too narrow for me, but overall, it was just serviceable to me. Overall, the 12 hours, I enjoyed it, but it's just like, I think I'm done. Like, I don't want to continue this game because I'm not really enjoying it that much.
Yeah. For sure. And again, we're going to get into a lot of the nitty gritty as far as, the different mechanics and stuff like that and how that kind of contributed to your experience as well. And for me, before I go to you, Matt, my service level thoughts with this game are actually fairly similar to Garrett's in a lot of ways where I think there's actually a lot of really good ideas in this game. And there is some stuff I really like with it. But there's also a lot of frustration that comes along with that and a lot of growing pains. You can definitely tell that this is like the first in like an idea that they might have had for like maybe a larger franchise where maybe like in a sequel to Monarch, I actually think that they could probably, if they iron out a lot of things, I think they could actually make like a pretty good experience anyways. But if you're just taking it like just playing, like evaluating just this game in particular, I don't know if the frustrations that you experience in the gameplay do outweigh the positive elements, but that's just how I feel like with the very limited playtime I have. But Matt, I'm interested to know what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I think Garrett kind of nailed it when he brought up repetition. This game is plagued by it. There are so many very old school design choices that just shouldn't be there, especially when we've seen the medium in JRPGs move forward in such a dramatic way over the last few years between stuff like, Persona 5 Royal, Tales of Arise, and even like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, right? Like they do meaningful things in the genre that I just feel like Monarch like looked at, took a couple things from, and then receded back into very old school, like PS2 or PS3 level era design stuff. Like Garrett mentioned, you'll do the same thing over and over. The flow of the game does not change. You'll leave one building, go to the next building. But the thing is, that building looks exactly like the building that you were just in. You'll get warped back to your main building after every significant thing and have to make your way all the way back. Sometimes fast travel is locked for no apparent reason because you have to do a thing. You have to see a 5-second cutscene halfway there. And then like, there's just so much because like, it's frustrating because there are good parts of this. The combat can be fun. And when everything clicks, you can really get into the flow of how the combat works. The antagonists are fantastic, generally speaking. Like they're not just this like cookie cutter evil mustache twirling villains that we can find too often in JRPGs. All of them have some significant form of trauma, which is just being amplified by the situation that they're in. And I really could understand most of the antagonists and where they were coming from. It's just that there's so many odd things that make this game such a slog to play through and just not enjoyable. Like you'll have to you get to a new floor of a building, you have to run all the way back up every floor that you just did. And like to Garrett's point, like there'll be times when you go into a new area and like if you don't call this number immediately to do a specific battle, the entire time that you're there, you'll just get absolutely mangled by everything around you. Like it's really frustrating because it has beautiful character artwork. It has so many cool ideas. I genuinely want to see where the story is going. And I actually do want to finish it. I kept pushing on despite all of this because I was enjoying it. And then I hit puzzle wall after puzzle wall after puzzle wall. And the game takes all of these mechanics that it sets up, throws it out the window and expects you to be able to just figure things out. Like I emailed PR like 4 times in my final 3 or 4 hours with the game, when for the 20 or so hours leading up to that, I was able to figure things out. But the difficulty scale and the ramp up in terms of puzzles and combat and everything else, it just makes no sense. I just wish this game was better because I do see it. I do see the potential for it. It's just, it isn't where it should be. And like graphically it's disappointing, but like I think for all 3 of us, graphics aren't the be all and end all. Like the Trails of Cold Steel series isn't the prettiest game, but like the combat and everything about it just functions in such a fundamentally exciting way that you look past the graphics. So like graphics aren't great, but again, if the rest of the game was able to carry it, then whatever. I'm probably going to go back to it, honestly, because I feel like I put this much time into it. Like it's a sunken cost fallacy at this point. I want to see what happens, but I'm going to wait for guides because I'm sick and tired of trying to figure this out. And like some of these puzzle solutions are so asinine that it's like, all right, forget it.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I think I'm going to wait till guides as well, because even like the first 10 hours, I was able to get through, but I had to like, wait, what do I do? There's no direction. There's absolutely no direction when it comes to these puzzles. So yeah.
A lot of the puzzles that I found, even at the beginning, kind of reminded me of like old like Secret of Monkey Island puzzles, where there'd be like a bunch of random things you'd have to do that the game didn't really give you a lot of like at least obvious direction to kind of figure out how to get past some of them. Especially like the first one I ran into in the demo where you had to get like a locker combination. Like that puzzle, like had to be running around the campus for like the school building for like 2 hours trying to figure out what the heck I was even supposed to do. And then I hear from Matt, it only, gets more complicated from there. So
it does get more complicated.
So it's just
kind of crazy.
It's little things like that. But I think we'll go into dive more of that a little bit later when we talk about, the exploration of the game. But obviously the first thing I want to start with as we kind of dissect the game is we got to talk about the story, because I think I think talking about the story is important, but I think we want to, of course, keep it service level because we don't want to spoil the game. Obviously, the game's not out until Friday, so we want to make sure that this is a spoiler-free environment. So don't worry about spoilers or anything like that. But just kind of a quick setup. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Sorry, Ryan. It's out on the 22nd on Friday.
Even faster. I mean, even farther away. Sorry. There you go. But yeah, so obviously, since it's not out till next week from the time we're recording this, obviously we don't want to spoil the story. So let's really quickly talk about kind of the overview of the story itself. Basically, you play as a unnamed character that you get to name yourself.
Yes.
Who basically wakes up in a school one day and it's covered in mist, and there's these monsters that come from these cell phones, and these cell phone signals are basically driving the other students mad. And it's basically your job to kind of clean up the mess and basically stop the mist from appearing on each floor. And then that's pretty much as far as I got in the story, and as far as where I kind of want to go with the story, as far as giving you a synopsis, because again, there's a lot more to it than that. Obviously, your character gets powers, but again, I'm not going to iterate how that comes about or anything like that. I kind of want everyone to kind of experience that on your own. That's just a general idea is what you're doing in this game, though. So, Garrett, what did you think about the story in Monark overall from what you've played?
Well, it's serviceable so far. I mean, like, again, I'm not too far into it. I think the story is I wouldn't say predictable, but it's very structured. And it just goes along with the level design itself. I think Matt nailed it on the head earlier, is that the characters and the character relationships were kind of cool. The art was really awesome. I think they have a lot of personality with the villains as well, and the motivation behind each of the major bosses. I really do like the demos, like major villain in there, and the cut scene, and having that cool boss right there. It's just like, okay, this is some awesome artwork. They actually put some time into this. So I think that's what's the highlights of the story so far is the character art and everything like that. What I don't really care about this story, and I think this is just more of a Japanese culture thing itself, and not really anything bad about the team or whatever. It's more, you could tell it's Japan, because they just talk about, let's get together with women. It's like, it's all about the protagonist getting with a woman, and like, it's like, oh, Teach, why don't you do this? It seems a little, I don't know, awkward to me. But I think that's just the Japan culture itself. It's not like anything else. But yeah, the story is so far okay. It's not like gripping me, but there's some highlights for sure. Yeah.
And I have to agree with you with both the villain that you see at the beginning, the very first villain you run into, and then also I really like the companions that you have with your main character.
Yeah,
I think they're all really interesting, and yeah, the art for each of the characters. Like, I love all the character portraits and stuff like that. Like, I almost wish that instead of doing like a 3D game, like, I almost wish that this was like a 2D game, and they went with like a hand drawn style, like almost like something like Astria Ascending's art style. I think might actually work a little bit better as far as, the way they draw the world versus having it be like a 3D type of, Persona-like experience in a lot of ways. But Matt, what do you think about the story in Monark?
The story is one of my favorite parts, honestly. There are issues with it. The pacing can be very strange, especially in the first half of the game. Everything feels very disjointed because you are kind of free to tackle the first bunch of things in whatever order you choose to. So you don't really have that, and like every time that you do, you only have one companion with you who's central to that area's plot. So like there isn't really a sense of camaraderie between them. Each of the characters is really interesting. They're well written. They all feel very different from one another. And again, the motivations for both the characters and the antagonists genuinely feel understandable. Like all of them feel like these could be real people who have suddenly come into power and are trying to accomplish what they want to do. But a lot of it, I could understand being in their position, which I think is a massive testament. And like the thing with a lot of JRPGs too, you can get into some really cringy dialogue. And while that does come up occasionally, largely that's not really an issue with Monarch. Like I didn't feel myself being like, oh, why did they say that? Like, again, a couple times, sure. But like I found it largely really interesting. And the back half of the game takes you to some really unexpected places. And that's why like I'm genuinely curious to see how this plays out. There seem to be, and I can't confirm this as of yet, but like there seem to be hints of possible alternate endings. There seem to be hints of possible alternate finales entirely, like just of the way that the game is currently setting itself up to where I'm at. Again, I don't know if this is going to be the case. I don't know if they're going to find a different resolution that ties everything together nicely, but it seems like there are going to be different endings, and it seems like there are going to be different ways to tackle things, especially in the back half of the game. So I really enjoy the story for what it is. And I do feel that the story, and like what you guys already mentioned, the character artwork and the voice of all the characters really do stand on their own well here. And that's probably one of the best parts of the game, because if the biggest thing that I can say is if that demo doesn't like tickle your curiosity, the rest of the game isn't going to do anything for you. And like there isn't really, in my opinion, enough there to kind of carry the experience outside of that. So like my advice would be like try the demo. And if you feel at the end of the demo, because Ryan, when you and I spoke about the demo on the PlayStation Drive, you were a little bit warmer on it than I was. But like I started to appreciate the demo by the end, because it does take a little bit for you to warm up to it. And like I genuinely want to see where the story goes, because I am wrapped up in it by this point. I do want to see what happens. It's just the rest of the game that we're going to talk about is making that very difficult for me to do. No,
and if anything, it's just a testament to the writing in the game and how well done it is. So I'm glad to hear that the story itself like pays off towards the end of the game, and it definitely has got its hooks into you. So that is awesome to hear, to know that obviously if the game, even at the very beginning doesn't maybe click with you with the story, at least there is stuff to look forward to. Or again, that's also good to know in case for things to point out for like if they ever did a Monarch 2, what elements would they need to improve? And doesn't sound like the story would have to be one of those things.
There is one thing, and I'm not going to spoil what that one thing is, and we can talk about this after if you guys are curious, but there is one story beat that almost made me want to put the game down because of how absolutely unnecessary it was. There's something that happens that literally left like my jaw on the floor, made me very, very viscerally angry, and I almost stopped playing it at that point because there was no need for it. There was no need. It was like one of those moments where it's just like useless drama and useless plot twist just thrown in because they want to complicate the situation. Now, granted, that is specific to one area. So like that doesn't largely matter outside of it. It doesn't affect the main story path itself. But there like so far, which makes me a little bit nervous for where this game might be going. But there is one story beat that I almost threw the controller through the TV. I got really mad because of just how unnecessary it was.
Jesus. Right.
Yeah. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
That is kind of crazy. And to be fair, Matt's actually hinted to me that there's something he's like itching to talk about. I'm sure that's probably what that is. So,
sounds good.
So before we go any further, of course, we open the floor up to questions. So we actually got some questions, and I'm kind of going to intersperse them as we go. And this one, while it doesn't specifically relate to the story, I mean, Andrew Semichek over at We the Nerdy asked this question. He wanted to know how this game compares to the Persona series, because he asks, comparing this to other Persona-like games to come out post Persona 5, where does this game rank? So obviously, story is a big element in the Persona games, and the way that you interact with the story is a big element. And I know a lot of people, for whatever reason, before this game came out, we're kind of comparing it to Persona, even though I don't know why. I don't think the story really has anything like really much in common with the Persona games beyond, the way you kind of get your powers in this, even though the way you get them in this is different from Persona. I can see maybe comparisons there, but Garret, is there anything, what do you think about Andrew's question in particular?
I mean, yeah, I could see the comparison with Persona, especially from like the trailers. There's actually there's a lot of, I guess, design choices. How about that? It's like there's various tiny details. They're like, you played Persona and you straight up ripped from a Persona game and put it in here. And I won't detail out examples right now. But I can see there was like probably a handful of people in that development team that love Persona, and they wanted to put some Persona love in there. Comparing it to Persona in terms of the story, I say it's not even close. Maybe it's like maybe the characters and as Matt said, the character art and the motivations, they're pretty good, but they're just nowhere near close to a Persona story, I think. So yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
Matt, any thoughts?
No, I have to agree. While I do think that the story is interesting, I think comparing it to Persona, to SMT5, to Tales of Arise, to a lot of the big JRPGs from the last few years, it just doesn't stay in the same camp. Like it doesn't belong to be mentioned in the same category and the same caliber as those games, because like there is just so much more that those games do that deserve the praise that they got compared to this. This just kind of exists in the same space. And I can understand the comparisons. You're in a school, you're a student, like there's no like romance system or anything, but that wasn't really properly answered before launch. So by the way, there's no romance system. There's no like way to date your friends or anything like that. There's no social links, but like, it seems like the way that they were selling the game almost made it seem like, oh, it might be there, because like, that wasn't at least as far as I know, that really wasn't a question that was answered beforehand. So I can understand the comparisons, but this feels to me, like Garrett mentioned, and especially like Ryan, you said, some of these developers are ex-SMT devs. Like they took parts of it and kind of tried to mold it to make it feel different, but I just don't think it was very successful.
Yeah, and the main reason I wanted to ask this question here in particular is because as you two have kind of alluded to, really the only thing that I think is close to Persona in this game is the way some of the story stuff is set up. But yeah, beyond that, the combat obviously is completely different. It's not like you're catching, demons to kind of carry in your army. Well, you do have some stuff that you summon, and we'll talk about that in combat. But beyond that, you're not, talking to your enemies and like bribing them to come to your side or anything like that, or like a lot of the other elements of the game are really like borrowed from Persona in a lot of ways. So the story would be the closest thing I would compare to it. And even then it's like not even really a comparison, but also you have to remember too, and this I think, is very telling. Number one, the studio that made this actually is only made up of, 70 people, and that's not even all developers. Like there's also, other staff that work there that aren't even working on the game. Combined with the fact that I just think it's a lower budget project than, something like Persona is, or something like Shin Megami Tensei is. And it definitely shows. So just, go into it with that mindset, and I think you'll come away with it a little bit better. Like I would put it closer in the budget level to something like the Caligula Effect 2, or, one of the Hyper Dimension Neptunia games, or something like, or something like Trails of Cold Steel, something like that. Like that kind of like, it's almost like a B tier game as far as, the budget is concerned. So just keep that in mind going into it. It's also unfair to kind of compare it to like a AAA game in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But like, see, that's the interesting thing, because I would put Trails of Cold Steel in the same caliber as like a Persona or something, because I do think that the Trails series has a lot.
Good, Matt.
That's what I mean, right? Like, I understand like the budget comparison, but like,
Well, the difference is they subvert expectations in a way that this game just doesn't. That's
exactly subverting expectations.
And speaking of Neon Falcon, Garrett, we're going to be talking about them on the show in a few weeks, and I'm excited to talk about them.
Can't wait.
So look forward to that episode soon. But next up, I feel like we should move on from the story and let's talk about the combat mechanics in this game, because I think, to me personally, I think from what I've played so far, that's the thing that got me the most excited to play it, because the combat in this game is very strategic. It is mostly about positioning with the enemy. Like, rather it being a grid-based game, it almost reminds me more of something like Valkyria Chronicles versus a game like Fire Emblem, where essentially each of your characters, you can switch to whichever character you want at any time, and you basically assign them for each turn, and they basically get like a giant circle around them, depending on your characters. Some characters can move further than others, and basically the goal in mind that you want to do is kind of position as many of your guys around an enemy at once, because whenever you initiate an attack, all of your allies in the range of that enemy, in their attacking range, will attack that enemy. So it basically leads to a lot of situations where like you want to maybe position your guys around the back of an enemy because also the enemies can counterattack you whenever you attack. And it just leads to like a really like interesting and dynamic battle system that I actually really enjoyed. Like I found myself like grinding away during the early parts of the game and just enjoying my time with it the entire time doing it. But I don't know how that experience kind of carries farther into the game. So I'm gonna start with you, Garrett, and then we'll go to Matt. What's your perspective on the combat? First of all, does it get too grindy as far like does it feel worse as it goes along? What do you think?
Well, I think the reason why I didn't progress as much in a certain point is because I had to grind. And I think it's just a matter of like scaling levels per se, rather than just like, oh, it's really hard. And I really felt it with this third level or this third area I'm in. Once I got into a combat feel or whatever, normally my level is the same as like the others. I'm like, all right, we're doing pretty good. And then at this point, they were like 6 or 7 levels ahead of me. I'm like, what did I do? Like, what happened? I feel like I skipped levels. And unfortunately, you cannot go to easier areas, at least from what I could tell in the game. Like, I went down all the way to the most basic level you can do. And even at that, the baseline of the levels themselves in that area is still like levels ahead of me. So scaling the levels with the monsters is a problem with this game. Let me go into more specifics of the combat though. You did a pretty good job of explaining the circle and the range and the positioning. I think that's a pretty interesting combat detail that I haven't really seen much in other games. And I appreciate the novelty of it. And they tried to advance a little bit more with, let's say, level design, where there was certain obstacles that kind of like, there's like a barrier between you and the enemies. And so you probably don't want to break that down, or maybe you do want to break it down in order to get around or flank the enemy or something like that. There's sometimes little like poison or slash kind of like auras or whatever. If you're in this kind of range or area at the end of the turn, you'll get hit by this like affliction of some kind, either poison or some bleeding damage. Sometimes there's a healing aura where you can heal up your stuff. I thought the AI was pretty good. Like it didn't seem like it was like way too easy or even like way too difficult in certain areas. I think the AI was fine. The movement and the way they used their skills was great. And then also how to progress your characters, right? You beat the area, you get spirit, and that spirit you can buy skills, and those skills level up your characters and level up your companions, so on and so forth. And then the more skills you have, the more variety and more strategy that you can have with your group. And I think that was a pretty good deal as well. What really bogged me down was the grinding. It was like when I skipped to that level and now everything was 5 or 6 levels ahead of me, I was struggling. I had to put casual mode on. I was not having that much fun when it got there. But other than that, it was pretty good combat, I think.
Nice. Also, I should throw out there as well, there's no random battles in this game, which is nice.
Right.
So it's not like some other RPGs that we're playing nowadays. Like essentially, you have to make a phone call to a specific like phone number because of course this game has a big thing about cell phones, and basically where all the monsters come from is from cell phone lines. So you basically get teleported to basically an alternate place, and that's where you fight the monsters. That's kind of how that works. And then essentially, once you're in a phone number and you complete a battle, you can then replay that battle over and over and over again, as many times as you want. And then basically what it'll do is when you replay the battle, it'll kind of randomize the positions of the enemies. So it feels different each time. So you're not kind of playing the same exact thing over and over again, which I thought was an interesting way to kind of handle battles design, especially because again, I'm just so happy they didn't go with random battles versus a lot of other games of this type. But Matt, let's hear from you, especially because you're much farther in the game. So I'm curious to know, kind of going off Garrett's point, does the level scaling become like completely out of whack later on in the experience? What do you think?
Yes, and yes. I genuinely do really enjoy the combat as well. It does remind me of, to keep bringing this up, Trails of Cold Steel, almost 1-to-1 with a couple of different things along the way in terms of how you move, in terms of how you can kind of, jump on attacks, and like you really do have to be careful with your positioning. Like you mentioned, like if you back attack, then you're going to get away. You're not going to get countered, but anything in the front that's not a back attack, aside from some special abilities, you're going to get hit back. So it's really this balancing act of which character do I want to go first, because I know they hit harder with their counters, versus, you know, positioning versus using certain abilities where even though there are other allies around you, you know that they won't be able to gang up on them. I think a big part of the combat that we've left off so far is the mad and the awake gauges. Basically, like when you're running around in the mist, there's like Garret mentioned it earlier, but you have a gauge that's just called mad. That's just, you're essentially going insane as you're running around the area in the mist. And then that mad gauge carries on over into your combat, where your abilities, essentially you have physical attacks that will drop that, you know, cost HP to use. And you have special abilities that cost mad, you know, that fills up your mad gauge faster. If you get 100%, if you hit 100% mad, in the overworld, you're sent back to the infirmary and you have to make your way back. If you hit 100% mad in a battle, then your character essentially just loses it and everything just goes sideways. The awake gauge is kind of the counterbalance to that, where you can use certain abilities that'll rise your awake gauge. And when you hit 100% in your awake gauge, your mad gauge will drop back down to 0, and you can use like a super move. Evidently, I was never able to actually hit it, though I never really tried that hard, but it never came up naturally, where if you hit both mad and awake at 100% at the same time, you go into this like enlightened state. I was never able to do it. Was never able to do it. Never came up naturally through the flow of combat. So I don't know exactly what happens in that space, but just to show there's a lot of systems working in combat that honestly, you don't really need all of them, because they kind of just bog down the combat at a certain point, or they're there and you just never actually interact with them. Now, like Garret said, the level scaling is absolutely ridiculous, because even when it comes to grinding, if you drop back down to an earlier grind zone, the levels will stay. It's just like the amount of enemies or the types of enemies will change. So you have to basically hope and pray that the way that you kind of put your enemies in your allies in the positioning, that you'll be able to take down the enemies one by one before you get completely overrun. And there was times where I would spend 2 or 3 hours just grinding, because again, the spirit that you get to level up your characters is a pool that's shared amongst all of them. So especially the way that the skill buying scales, like you'll go like, okay, level 1 is 50, then it's 100, then it's 1500. And it's like, sure, that scales along with you, but it doesn't scale in a way that you can do these things quickly or easily. Like I would do one battle like 4 or 5 times just to be able to get one character up 3 or 4 levels. And you have to rinse and repeat that for your entire party, because you cannot have even a single party member that's significantly underleveled, or you will just get ransacked. And one of my most favorite parts of the game, every time you get a new character, every time you get a companion, they start at level 1, which mandatorily sticks you into grinding. And the thing is, it's like there will be times where it's like you have to bring 3 people or 3 allies into this combat. Guess what? Now we've given you a 4th one. Now you're going to bring 4 in, and that one is going to be at level 1. And guess what? Grinding is a pain, because again, all the enemies are the level that you're at, if not higher. So it's like there's so many like just strange design aspects to because like the core combat itself is a lot of fun, but there's so much going on around the combat that directly influences it that just gets unbelievably frustrating. That spirit pool that you use to upgrade your enemies, you also use that to buy items. Like there's just it's infuriating when these things kind of like align in a way, and like you'll walk into a boss encounter and you'll just get slapped down, and like again it does the whole thing. Main character dies, battle over. There's no way that you can do anything about it. One of your allies goes down, revives don't become a part of the game until like 70% of the way through the game. So even like your allies going down, just like there's nothing you can do about it, because you can't buy any items to revive them. There's only skills that let you do that. So like that's what I mean. Like the grind is inherently in the design process, because again, because there are no random battles, there's no like natural leveling curve to it. You have to put yourself in those situations and just play the same fight, because that's what I found myself doing. Instead of like jumping in between different fight zones because I think I might be able to handle this, I found one that I was able to make it through relatively, not easily, because like you do need to have some significant like difficulty level on there to get enough spirit that you're not wasting 6 hours grinding. But like you find one and then you just run it over and 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 over. Like it just gets so redundant so quickly. And like, again, the combat itself is fun. So I never really minded like the actual battling part of the battle. It's just that everything around it can get so obtuse and so weirdly designed that it just gets frustrating.
Yeah, it almost sounds like the strategy might be, for example, to like over level your characters before you go fight the boss in that area to the point where you think you're like 5 or 6 levels above that area. And then that way, when you get teleported to the new zone, you're essentially in that new zone at the level it's supposed to be at, so that you're not having to grind again at that point. Obviously, you're going to have to kind of finish that zone. And then when you get a new character, like it almost encourages you not to use them in any cases that you don't have to use them, and then grind for all the points with your higher level characters. And then you basically feed all those points that you get with the grinding with the higher level characters to the characters that start at level 1, which does not sound like it gets fun towards the end of the game. Like it
takes a lot of time, man.
Yeah.
Man, after that, just one scaled up jump, I'm just like, wow, I don't want to play this game this much because the grind is real. And again, casual mode on and the absolute easiest I can do. And I was just struggling to grind. And you know, grinding's fine. Like we have a lot of games that do the grind pretty well. You know, the Pokemon series, it can be pretty straightforward. Bravely Default does a very good job of fast forwarding and being super fast of leveling. It's just this one, it takes a long time to grind. It can be a struggle to grind. And it's like, grinding is fine, but it cannot be like this laborious, this chore that I want to do. So
yeah, I found myself like just buying the cheapest abilities rather than genuinely putting points into the ones I wanted, unless it was something that I really could, that I really thought I could use. And the game does this thing too, where like certain abilities are locked until you level other abilities up to a certain point. And those abilities will block your skill tree progression until you get like, again, like 2,000 spirit, which like earlier, like in the first half of the game is a lot to get this next skill. And it's like, I just found myself being like, okay, I'm like 6 levels behind. I'm just going to buy whatever's the cheapest. I never use this skill. I have no use for it. But just because you get like the general stat bonuses to all of your stats when you level. And the only way that you level is by buying these abilities. So like I would just be buying the stuff that's cheapest rather than the things that I actually wanted or needed. And it's like at that point, it's like, what's the point?
Yeah, I totally agree. I was doing the same exact thing when buying skills. It's like, oh, this one's, well, to me, it was like, oh, this is 400. Oh, this is 500. Oh, this is 10.
Yeah.
I don't want this at all.
But it's only 10. Only 10.
It's gonna level me up the same as the 150 one. And I just found like the skill building just stifled after there was requirements of like leveling up other skills. And it wasn't really that, directed at all. I wish there was like some sort of like direction towards the routes you want to go to like upgrade your skill tree. I don't know, like some sort of highlighted route or whatever, because there's a lot of skills to buy from in the beginning, and then it really stifles you to like 2 to 3 different ways. And it's just like, oh, which one do I go? You go with the cheapest and just keep on knocking that out.
Yeah.
So,
and that's why almost like the skill points that you receive, the spirit they receive should have just been used for just skills. And then your character should have just gotten normal experience. Like that probably just would have led to a much more balanced experience. And it wouldn't have led to you taking skills that you don't even want. Cause that's like kind of like the worst feeling in RPGs where you get like a skill that you're never going to use. Like whenever like I get like a sleep ability in a lot of RPGs, I'm like, I'm never going to use this at all. Or like when you gotta get a lot of like weird status effect abilities in like old RPGs and stuff like that. It's just like the combat system is really designed for you to take advantage of a lot of this stuff. So why am I even, using this? And I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but that's just kind of what it reminds me of. So
sorry, the last thing that I wanted to bring up about combat, because I just thought of it. You get like these like demon sidekicks essentially, and those are tied. The first one that you get is tied to a psychological test that you do at the beginning of the game. And like I love this idea. I think it's very, very cool. Like it kind of influences based on your choices what you're going to get. Now the issue that comes up is I didn't have a proper ranged character for quite a while, and again the companions that you get, like the actual person companions, only stay for their zones, at least in the first while. So like I was without a ranged character for quite some time. I was without a healer for quite some time, just because like you'll get more of these demons as you go. But again, like I don't know if it's exactly tied to which skill is then the next highest, because like your skills kind of map out as like, you know, like the 7 deadly sins. So like there'll be times where like you just don't have the right character that you need, and there's no way to augment those. Like I really wish that those demons can be changed and augmented to be like, okay, you know, I have a sword type, I want an archer, but like, no, okay, now I have a sword type and one with an axe. And it's like, there's nothing really you can do about it. Like, I wish there was more customizability within there so that you can better use those characters, even if, you know, like to kind of help round out your party. Cause then I think that would also make grinding a more enjoyable thing, because you're not just like, you know, relying on items or relying on, which again uses the spirit that you need to level. Like, there's just things like that I kind of wish was done differently, or even like a skill pool reset so that you could differently augment your characters. But it's just, there's things like that just meh.
No, I'm actually glad that you brought that up, Matt, because like that's totally different from my experience, where at the start of the game, not only did I get a ranged character as my demon character, but a ranged character where their first, like one of their first level, like 10 spirit abilities was a healing spell. So it was just like I had a ranged archer with healing, like at the beginning of the game where it sounds like you were totally struggling. So it was like, it sounds like we had a completely opposite experience, but just because of like the randomness that we put into the psychological test at the beginning. Like neither of us knew obviously the optimal path that you could have picked for that, but it just happened to be, I just happened to pick the right specific selection of choices to come up with the character, like the support character that I needed at the beginning of the game, which is just, you know, kind of bizarre to me. But speaking of grinding and the combat mechanics, I wanted to bring in the Muffin Mon over on Discord, who asked the question, since a few reviews mentioned grinding, I'm curious what difficulty you guys played on, and did you lower it to reduce the need to grind for levels? Also, would you recommend grinding early in the game and then hoarding spirits to level up for new party members immediately with? So I think that we kind of touched on a lot of these points, but I kind of wanted to bring in the Muffin Mon because, number one, we didn't really talk about what difficulty we started on, whether we started on the normal difficulty or we changed it up. Garrett, I know you said you started on one difficulty and changed it. Did you start on normal? Where did you start with the game?
So yeah, there's a normal and then there's a casual mode, and the casual mode is more like it's just you're a little bit like lower hit points to you, and you can hit a little bit more damage to the enemies. That was pretty much my notice with that. And yeah, I'm on casual mode now, and I'm struggling to grind in this game. The grinding early game seems pretty interesting. That could pay off at the end. A little bit. What I would do is like you can grind and then like spend skills, and then like you actually do get a rating system at the end of each of these like combat scenarios. And so if you do get like a B or let's say an A rank, you get more spirit, you get more accumulation with that. I always struggle to even score higher than a C because I just I take too many turns or a character dies, and man, they have some serious penalties when you do that, and that's unfortunate. I wish there wasn't as much penalty with like just turn-based stuff. I understand all the positive stuff in there, but man, they really bog you down on some of the penalties in that ranking system. But yeah, maybe you should grind early in the game. That's probably a lesson from all of us, really. Yeah. But I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts too.
Yeah, Matt, what do you think?
I disagree. And that's only because the amount that you get at the beginning of the game compared to later on in the game is absolutely ridiculous. Like if you spend a long time grinding in the early game, you might get like anywhere from 70 to let's say 100 spirit per battle if you do that battle, like you said, Garrett, really well. But getting those B's and A's is incredibly difficult. Similarly, I got like a couple A's early game, but most of the time I was sitting at like a D or a C because again, you took too long. You didn't use enough of like abilities. And like some of like the level requirements, like for like a high rank, they'll tell you have to finish the whole battle in like 2 or 3 turns. And I can't like conceivably understand how you could possibly do that. So I would actually tell you to just grind just enough, because the amount that you get later on, like you'll get a character at level 1, but then you do one battle and you'll get almost 3,000 spirit from one battle. And that can take that one level 1 character up to like a level, 18 or 19 pretty quickly. So I feel like it's a lot. You would waste a lot of time early on. Like I would just tell you to do the bare minimum to be at the level requirement, because then once you start hitting those levels high, like later on, you get a lot more spirit very quickly to get those low rank characters up in a decent amount of time. And just so I actually pulled up my gameplay footage recording here, just because casual mode now very much confuses me, because you can turn it on right from the get-go, which reduces your damage by 30, but increases the mad that you get gained in the mist by 50%.
Oh, I didn't even realize that.
So yes, you will take less damage, but you're the amount that your mad gauge goes up, which again, if you hit 100, you get sent back to the very beginning, back into the infirmary, is doubled. Well, it goes up by 50%. So like even casual mode, yes, you're taking less damage, but you're also increasing your basically game over state by 50%. Yeah. So like, what?
It actually sounds like it might be better to turn casual mode on when you're going to grind, because one of the things I noticed when you're grinding on a phone number is that the mad gauge resets every battle. So you don't ever have to worry about it like going over. So just having the reduced damage is probably what you really want out of that when you're grinding in particular, because then you don't have you have to worry less about positioning. You still have to obviously worry about it, but less about it than if you have it turned off, essentially, because you're not worried about the mad gauge at that point, essentially, because you're never going to reach the the 100 you're going to need to do the godlike move anyways. So why would you even care about that? So that's just my take.
The mad gauge in battle, if you hit 100, then it's a bad thing. You essentially lose all control of the character. Yeah. So like I think you're 100% on. Turning that on while you're grinding is probably a genius idea, because you'll take less damage and you're not running around in the mist anyway. For your kind of that ticking clock that Garrett mentioned earlier is not an issue at that point. And again, like your health and your mad will get reset when you're grinding. But like, I just feel like that's such a strange way to handle a casual mode, which is supposed to be more accessible, when you take less damage, but the game over state comes at you even faster when you're trying to do these puzzles and stuff.
It just means you got to go quick. Just be like Sonic and you'll be fine.
So for myself, I just played on the regular difficulty, the standard difficulty. I never turned on casual mode.
Okay. That's good to know. All right. And now it's time to talk about Matt's favorite thing in the game, the exploration mechanics. We got to talk about this, because that's kind of the other half of this game. In fact, actually, unless if you didn't do as much grinding in this game, it would definitely be the thing you do the most in this game, is exploring the environment. So this is going to be an interesting subject. We already kind of heard what Matt had to say about a lot of this stuff. So Garrett, I'm going to start with you. What do you think about the exploration mechanics in this game and kind of the art of exploring this world? And as well, we got to talk about some of the puzzles too that come with that.
Yeah, I think one word can really describe the whole thing. It's directionless. Like, it's completely directionless. You don't know where to go. So basically, in order to like beat these areas, you're like at one floor, there's a mist, and of course the mad gauge goes up, so that's the time limit, and then you're trying to figure out how to get rid of that mist. And so there's a lot of cryptic kind of messages going on with like students that are hypnotized, or let's say documents that are like on the wall, or maybe there's a locker that has a code, just various things. And then you hit an obstacle of like with a student interaction or whatever. It's like, okay, we need to talk to this student and see if there's a dialogue option to get past this obstacle. And then you figure out, oh, you only have one dialogue option. All right, you're going to have to figure out how to get more dialogue options in order to get past this level. So yeah. And so you try to explore the whole floor to figure out where the puzzle is. I would have to say I think Matt would agree, the first 12 hours or the first 10 to 12 hours, it's manageable, I would say. It didn't seem to like a little too complicated in certain spots. There were some spots where I had to really think, because they give you riddles, and pretty hard ones too. I remember one, it was like a username and password, and you're locked in a room. That one, I was like, stop. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Like, what is the password? And you have to actually really think about it. You have to do like 3 or 4 different types of transformations or avenues of these riddles in order to really get the information you need to get out of that room. So yeah, it's very cryptic. Especially like even the building after the first one, Ryan, it gets pretty complicated or pretty complex. And I wouldn't say like complexity is the big thing. It's just a lack of direction. So you don't know what to do in a lot of certain aspects. But once you figure it out, I feel like it's a good accomplishment. I feel very overcome with accomplishment once I figure out what that puzzle is and I go on to the next one. So yeah, that's what I think about it. It's very cryptic.
Yeah,
that's a good way to put it.
I think you definitely like hit the nail perfectly on the head with that, where it's like, I don't think that the puzzles themselves are difficult. It's just that they're frustrating because the game doesn't give you enough like in-game direction for you to figure out them a lot of times, or some of the solutions or how you get there, like the method you get to the solutions are sometimes like really obtuse, and it's hard to kind of think about that. But Matt, I know you got a lot to say about this, so I'm gonna let you just jump in with this.
So I actually loved the puzzles for my first 15 to 18 hours with the game. Yes, they can be very cryptic. I think directionless, Garrett, you nailed it. Like, it's so funny because the game is simultaneously directionless and just one giant corridor. You don't really have any freedom. Exploration is like in the overworld is entirely useless. Outside of picking up like scraps of things that goes into like your library, which just gives you more kind of lore information like that. There are no side quests. There's nothing to kind of really do there. It's just kind of, here's the story, here's the route that you're on, and that's all you're going to do. The early game, or at least the first 15, I would say the first 50% of the game, the puzzles can get frustrating. They can get annoying, but you can always kind of figure it out because most of the time the solutions are, if not in the room that you're in or in the things that you're carrying, but at least on the same floor or nearby. There are certain ones where like you have to, like there was one puzzle that had there was a character who was very distressed, and she was asking for the names of her children. And like you learn like by kind of talking to other students and by doing stuff that she like loves swords, and you find scraps of paper around her that are either the names of swords or people who make swords. And then it's kind of figuring out which of these do you have to actually input. And there's like a string of them. There's some really, really clever ways to do it. And the biggest thing that I'll say for anybody listening who wants to get into this game, talk to literally everyone.
Yep.
Because the information that they're giving you might not be important, but their name or something like their student number or a piece of their information in your kind of like general, like, because every time you talk to someone, they get registered into your compendium almost, and you learn a little bit more about them, and that information can become very key. So like trying to figure those things out really does give you those like eureka moments when it finally clicks. The back half of the game takes all of that setup that they did in its first half and entirely throws it out the window. Like the first puzzle that you hit in the back half of the game, I spent probably 4 hours running around aimlessly the entire campus because you are completely lost in what to do. I had to email PR for the solution to the problem, and I still don't know why that was the answer. I tried to work backwards from what they told me, and I still couldn't figure out why that was the solution to the problem. Like it kind of takes everything that it sets up and completely just sends you on a massive campus sprawling, run around. And again, the world isn't pretty to look at. The overworld, when you're running around, locks the camera in this really awkward, camera view where it's like, it's not over the shoulder. It's not behind the back. It's not over your head. It's this weird in between that like hurt my neck just watching the character move in the overworld. The puzzles are really good until they get so obtuse and so just completely like there's no hints. There's nothing that you can do. So like after hour like 18, I think I emailed asking for help like 4 separate times. And by the 4th time, the solution that I was given was so incredibly obtuse and just like some of these, like you'll have to look at stuff in the environment. But again, there's mist everywhere and the things can be hard to read. And even playing on the PS5 where it looked, you know, as let's call it crisp as it did, I can't imagine trying to solve those problems or those puzzles on something like a Switch where the resolution is much worse and the game looks a lot worse. And there's things in the environment that you have to like try and figure out. Like it's just, I wish there was a hint system. I wish there was some way for you to kind of be like, okay, maybe this is a direction that I could go in, because sometimes you're left completely out in the dark with no idea from where to go. And like, I am not a puzzle person. I really am not. I hate puzzles, generally speaking. They're not my go-to for any sort of game, but I found myself enjoying the front half of the game's puzzles because even if they took me a bit, when it clicked, I really did feel like, okay, now I get it. I understand. I'm good. The back of the game throws all that away and just gets frustrating to the point where that was the reason I put the game down, was because I hit a puzzle that was so completely obtuse that I just like, I couldn't imagine dealing with what was coming next without a guide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to get even further in the game to see like even like how crazy the puzzles get even towards the end of the game in particular, like how they even evolve from there. And yeah, I'm really interested also to even read some guides on this to see like how guide writers even, you know, tackle, you know, finding some of the solutions to some of this stuff. But yeah, it's there's a lot there. And yeah, it's one of those things where if, you know, puzzles aren't really your thing, or, you know, like if you don't like old school RPGs that rely on you talking to every single person in the environment, then I think obviously this kind of gameplay model probably just isn't going to work for you. Like, again, it feels like when I'm having to talk to literally everyone, it reminds me of playing, you know, like Super Nintendo RPGs where they don't really give you a hint system in, you know, something like Trials of Mana. You have to talk to everyone in town to figure out, you know, what the heck you're supposed to go do next. And I got kind of a similar feeling from this as well. So I think that's kind of where they were going with that. But yeah, like a hint system or something like that would have gone a long way to maybe alleviating some of that stuff for sure. I think it almost, again, I made the comparison earlier, but it definitely feels like almost like something like Secret of Monkey Island or something like that, or like old school, like point and click adventure games where you got to literally talk to everyone. Then the puzzle is just like, what? Like, why do I need the fish to hook into like the crank? So then I crank open like the pipes in order to let steam through or something like that. Like, what did I need the fish for? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So there you go. But of course, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to overall thoughts, obviously you talked about it a little bit there, Matt, when you talked about the platforms. So again, you played on PlayStation 5 because this game's on PlayStation 4, PC, and Switch. Whereas Garret and I, we were playing on Switch. And I mean, I think I will say the performance as far as the frame rate was actually pretty solid for the most part, other than in some cutscenes. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe I had a smoother experience than Garret. I don't know. I guess we're going to find out. But the resolution in particular, or some of the character models, oh boy. Garret, I'm going to go to you. What do you have to say about the Switch's performance with this game?
Yeah, no, it's stable in the demo. When you go outside in the school grounds, it gets choppy. It gets pretty choppy. I would say it gets as low levels as Age of Calamity choppy. Like, and I'm like, dude, how's it this? Like, I imagine I can count the frames in a second, at least like 12 to 15 or something like that. But other than that, performance, like, for this type of game, I'm not going to bog on it too much. I'm not going to complain about it too much because I feel like I'm playing like a Vita game too. It's that kind of, you know what you're getting into when you're putting it on the Switch. So I'm not going to try to like really harp on it too much. There was just like, I can't believe it's that bad kind of performance, but I can still play this game. There, you know, the main infirmary, not the infirmary room, the main hub, Matt, where you have all your companions together and
the student council room.
Yeah, the student council room. That's correct. Once I got my last companion, no joke, it chugged.
Oh my God.
It's starting to chug. And I'm like, it's just because there's too many assets in that room. And I'm like, I can't believe it. You're hitting the limits of the Switch with this kind of Vita-like graphics, with these kind of rough animation. I feel like I was playing a late PS2 game on the Switch. No joke. Other than the character art, looked great. Voices, fantastic. But yeah, guys, if you guys don't care about graphics, if you can manage to go through kind of the frame rates and you love portable systems, Switch is fine. Mm-hmm. A fine system to go through. But if you really want to get the smoothest experience, of course, and the most stable experience, I would go over to PS5.
So then quick question for you, Garrett. Did you mostly play in handheld mode or did you play docked at all? Or did you mix and match?
I play exclusively on handheld.
Okay. Because I will say I primarily played it docked and I didn't run into a lot of those problems. Like even when I went to the open world, I did sure, the frame rate slowed down, but it wasn't like as bad as you were describing. I definitely noticed a big difference in handheld mode versus docked with this game in particular.
Got it.
Like even the resolution I found was much better in docked mode, where it looked like it was closer to 720p versus in handheld mode, where it looked like I was playing like a 540p game or lower sometimes.
It was pretty rough resolution wise, for sure.
And then I will say though, the combat, the frame rate, I didn't really run into any problems in the combat as far as the frame rate is concerned, which is where obviously the frame rate I think matters most on Switch for a game like this. Whereas the exploration, like if it slows down while I'm exploring things, it takes me out of it, sure, but it's not unplayable to your point. So yeah, it's you have some concessions, but yeah, if you're going to pick up the Switch version at all, play it in docked mode. I think that you're going to get a much better experience out of it. But Matt, how was the game on PlayStation 5?
Totally fine. I had no issues. It ran at a stable 60 frames per second. There was it is not a pretty or very graphically demanding game. I imagine it's struggling a little bit more on Switch just because of poor optimization. Because had performance wise, I really can't say anything negative about it on PS5. It ran totally fine. Now, like I said, the one thing that I would caution, and I'd be curious to see if either of you guys decide to keep going with this game, to see if playing on Switch, especially in handheld mode, would hamper your ability to solve some of these later game puzzles, because the environment does become important. And sometimes it's things like the mist, sometimes it's like poor color choices, sometimes things just blend in together, even on PS5. So like I would just caution that. Just be aware that if you are picking it up on the Switch, if once you get into the later game, if you're solving a puzzle, you might be better off docking it, because that may help more than anything else. But yeah, no, on PS5, I had absolutely no issues with performance.
Okay. And before we move on from this as well, Garrett, Matt had actually flagged something when we were playing the demo on PlayStation 5 about the load times for the game. So what were the load times like on Switch? I know I obviously know the answer, but I want to hear from you.
It was fine. Like, I felt like it wasn't different than other games.
It was pretty quick, right?
Did you have an issue? Yeah, it wasn't that bad at all. So I did not wait around.
Fun
too
fact,
much on the Switch.
The load times on the Switch version are almost identical to the PS5 version. just throwing it out there.
There you go.
Then that upsets me even more.
Yeah, because Matt was pointing out like it took like a couple seconds or even like maybe like 10 seconds to load in new areas. But I think it was something we talked about on the PlayStation Drive episode where we were talking about our first impressions, where I think it's just the game is just designed to sit in the loading areas, even if the console can load the game faster, essentially because it's a concession to other platforms. So that's just what it sounded like here. But I wanted to bring that up again because I know that was something we talked about a few weeks ago on the PlayStation Drive when we were talking about our impressions with the game. So before we move to final thoughts, I'm going to bring in Mike at Blaze Knight 0923, who asked us a bunch of questions, and we've covered some of this stuff. I just didn't want to bring up a question every single time we were coming to each one of these points, but we'll talk about them here in case there's anything we missed. First question is, in a crowded sea of RPGs, what makes this one special from our other RPGs? So the thing is, I think what's special about this game in particular is the combat system. And kind of that's really the thing for me personally that really sets it apart. And of course the soul system, but I don't think that necessarily sets the game apart in a necessarily positive way. But I do think the combat in particular is like really different from a lot of other games out there. Again, it's closer to something like Valkyria Chronicles, but it's also very different because again, you're not, shooting a gun at the enemy in the same way that you did in that game, especially because that was all like long range weapons and tanks and stuff like that. Whereas this feels like a Fire Emblem game and a Valkyria Chronicles games combat kind of like mixed together to fuse like this like completely different combat style. So I think for me personally, what sets this game apart from other games is the combat. And that was the thing I liked about the game the most. But obviously I know it gets, you struggle with it probably as the game goes on. And I just hadn't got to that point yet. So Garrett, what do you think your answer to this question is?
I think it's just one of the more obtuse RPGs I've played in a pretty long time, I think. I mean, that makes it what's it special. I think I do like the kind of the themes behind this game. I'm actually pretty behind it, like the ideals and the 7 deadly sins. I think they do an okay job of setting the atmosphere of this game. I don't think we talked about this too much, but I do like the questionnaires that I kind of have to go through. There was actually one recent kind of literally a point and click adventure type of situation where I had to escape with a princess through a cave or whatever. And you had to make the right decisions in order to like increase certain of your skills or whatever. I think they do a pretty good job of like, they know what their theme is. They know what their atmosphere is. They know their story, I think, is pretty good too. But yeah, I think it just stops right there. I think it's just one of the more obtuse RPGs I've played in a really long time.
Yeah, for sure. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I genuinely enjoy a lot of the story and a lot of the character writing. I feel like a lot of the dialogue that comes across and a lot of the character motivations, both protag and antagonists alike, are very interestingly put together. And like Garrett mentioned, I loved the psychological aspect of the game in terms of like the different tests that you'll do, because you'll have kind of like your main one initially, but they'll spring up if you talk to the right, students along the way, or even if you talk to certain other people along the way, that will boost your skill, like boost your base traits in different ways. I really loved that system because I just kind of answered honestly, and whatever the game gave me is whatever the game gave me. But I liked that moment, and you'll have almost like a horoscope like thing where like when you answer the questions, they'll be like, this is actually like these questions were actually posed to see how you are as a lover, for example, or how you would handle this situation, or how your personality is in this way. How accurate these things are, I don't know. But in terms of just like kind of like the added value of them, I do think they're cool. I do think they're interesting. And like Garrett mentioned, the one particular highlight for me was, again, the whole like setup of like you're a person who's going to be marrying someone, and then you have to try and escape this castle. Like it's a whole thing that takes place over like 15 to 20 questions, and that changes depending on your answers. So there are some really cool ideas in this game. And I think what makes it special is its story, is its characters, and is the kind of psychological aspect that they try and bring in.
For sure. All right. Next question from Mike. He asks something we talked about already. What's the difference between the Switch version and the PS5 version? Ultimately, other than the graphics, you're not really getting anything different. Especially, I'm the only person here who's played both versions of the game, and honestly, it's just a much better experience. Even probably on PS4. I think if you've got a PS4 and not a PS5 yet, I think the PS4 is definitely the way to go with this game for sure, and not the Switch version, unless you just really need to play it portably. But again, sounding by, when you get the last half of the game, like even playing portably is not going to be a thing. Like I can't even imagine playing this on a Switch like Garrett, like towards the end of the game where you don't have the docked option or anything like that.
I do say the OLED screen is very nice, and I think that's just due to the OLED itself. It looks really good. Yeah. Just how colorful it looks on that screen. So,
all right. Next question is something we can't answer, but I wanted to bring it up real quickly. When this comes to PC, how good will the computer will I need to run the game? So honestly, we don't know anything about the PC version at this point. I imagine you're not going to need a very good computer to run it, but who really knows, unfortunately.
Probably a 1050 Ti is totally fine. Yeah. It will run it, no problem.
The only thing that we know for sure is that my laptop from like 4 or 5 years ago will not be able to run the game. But every other computer will probably be able to do it.
Probably not.
All right. Next up, what contemporary RPGs is this most related to? So again, I would say it's got a little bit of elements of Persona and Shin Megami Tensei in there. And the combat, again, is very reminiscent of, other strategy RPGs. And it's kind of like this weird mishmash. But it's also kind of a very unique experience in a lot of ways. So I don't know if there's like a particular RPG I'd really compare it to beyond the comparisons really made. But do either of you guys have anything else to add to that as far as anything we didn't mention earlier? Nope.
No, I think it's fine.
Cool.
Yeah, I think for me, like, it's basically SMT meets Trails of Cold Steel.
Okay. Fair enough.
That kind of sounds like it was some Persona, like the weirdest design choices. Yeah, that's from a Persona game or whatever.
For sure. And then last question is one that I'm glad that Mike actually asked, which is, what is the RPG legacy of the Lankhar studio, the studio that actually developed the game? So for folks that don't know, and I'm glad we brought this up because Garret and I are probably not going to ever do an RPG game episode about this company in particular. So first off, all of the games that they develop, they don't usually develop on their own because, as I mentioned earlier, they are a smaller studio of about 75 employees, give or take. At this point. So a lot of the games they usually co-develop with another studio or they assist on them. This time around, they worked with Furyu, who did the Caligula Effect 2. But they've actually worked with companies like Atlas before and a bunch of other companies. And some of their earlier works include the Etrian Odyssey games, which Garrett's actually familiar with.
I like those.
They actually worked on Etrian Odyssey 1 and 2. They actually co-developed those games. They also worked on El Shaddai, Ascension of the Metatron on the PlayStation 3, which was kind of like an obscure RPG that I know some people have heard of. But then they also worked with Atlas on a few games, including Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey, which we talked about on the 3DS. And then also they worked on Persona Q2, New Cinema Labyrinth. They actually helped co-develop that game with Atlas. So they actually worked on a Persona game as well. And then they also worked on like the Strange Journey remake, which only came out in Japan. They also worked on a RPG on the PSP, or sorry, not the PSP, the PS Vita called Lost Dimension, which is like almost like a hidden gem for a lot of people. I've just never honestly played it, but I've heard a lot of really good things about that game. And then they've done a bunch of little things here and there that only came out in Japan, which we're not going to kind of touch on here. So they've been around since 2004, and they just have had a hand in a lot of like smaller RPGs. That's kind of been their jam throughout this entire their entire lifespan. So that's kind of the short history about them. Unfortunately, I couldn't dig up a lot more histories like about like how the company was founded or anything like that. Just a lot of that stuff's just not public. So I can't go in as much depth as I usually go in with some of our fun facts. But there you go. That's the quick history lesson. So overall thoughts. So we got to obviously put like a stamp of approval. Do we think people should play Monarch or not? Again, I'll start because, again, I'm the earliest in the game. I will say play the demo. If the demo strikes your fancy, then I think generally maybe even wait for a sale. And then once it's on sale, pick it up if you enjoyed the demo. Because the nice thing about the demo that unfortunately we three did not get to experience, but we know will be in the day one patch for the game, is the ability to transfer your save data over from the demo into the full game. So if you got to the end of chapter 1 in the demo and you're really enjoying it, I would say wait for a sale and then pick it up at that point. And I think you're hopefully going to have a good time. But Garret, what do you think? What's your recommendation? Do you think people should check out Monarch? Especially because you have to remember, this is a full price game coming out next week.
I totally, you said it, like, I totally agree with you. Play the demo. I think it really shines of what the game is in that demo. I really do, especially for what I played of it, like the first like 12 to 15 hours or whatever. But yeah, I agree with you. Wait for a sale. I can see myself if I was like looking at reviews, play the demo. If I like the demo, I'll be like, maybe 20 to 30 USD is probably a good sweet spot. Like I would definitely go for it. If you can, if you want to, I would definitely do the PlayStation version. Cause portably on Switch, whereas it's manageable, at least what I've played through, it does chug like in just certain areas. I'm like, man, am I playing in an MMO from like 2002 or something like that? It's those type of like kind of.
I was gonna say like the main campus area really reminded me of like the big towns in Monster Hunter Stories 2. And it just was, it's just one of those type of experiences. And again, as a Switch owner, you kind of know what you're getting into with a lot of this stuff too. So yeah. So that's generally what I recommend. I think like people who are really into JRPGs, who are really like these studios like NIS and then also like Xseed and Hyper Neptunia, I'm sure you probably would enjoy it quite a bit. But I would still say wait for guides.
Yeah.
Wait for a good month or two before you actually dive into it, so you can have a help from a guy to actually make it in more of an enjoyable experience. Yeah. And I think also if the release timing was different, I might feel differently about it, about that recommendation too. Cause I mean, you have to remember, we're not kind of, doing this review discussion in a vacuum. There are like so many releases coming out in the next like month and a half on Switch and PlayStation alone that it is a tougher sell, and which is why I think maybe the summertime is probably the perfect time to play a game like this. Although again, after the Nintendo Direct, like even June is starting to really fill up quickly with games too. So it's gonna be interesting to find a slot to play this. But Matt, final thoughts on the game. Do you first of all, do you recommend it? What do you think?
I really do think that only like diehard JRPG fans should be touching this game. Even if you play the demo and you enjoy it for what it is, if you've only really played it like a Persona or a Tales game, I would not tell you to just jump into Monarch, because I do feel like there is a lot of room for improvement here. And even the good parts of it, it takes work to see them. Definitely wait for a sale, especially like you said, Ryan, in this very crowded, early year. There's so much coming out around it that, especially at a Canadian $79.99, it's very hard for me to recommend this at full price. It's very hard for me to recommend this even at a sale for somebody who doesn't like really mess with the minutia of a lot of more obscure or lesser known JRPGs. I would really tell like only these diehards to give this game a look past the demo, because if you're a casual RPG fan and the demo, you're kind of like, this is kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of growing pains that you'll be going through with this game that could hamper your experience. As Garrett mentioned, waiting for guides is probably a very good call, because if you do get stuck or if you do get lost, just hopping on to, to a guide to kind of give you a sense of direction, or even just to help you solve the puzzle, would definitely make the experience more it would just make it a better experience. It would make it more fun. So for me, I would only recommend this to the diehards, and even then I would tell you to wait for a sale.
And one of the things I fully expect whenever, guides are developed for this game is that there'll probably be spoiler-free guides that you can reference. And honestly, if you can get your hands on a spoiler-free guide for the game, like I think that's the way to make it kind of be the optimal experience, where you're not spoiled on the story, and then you're able to get through a lot of the more difficult puzzles later on, and just enjoy the experience a lot more. So I think that's all we have to say about Monarch. But before we go to plugs, Matt, real quick, first of all, thank you for being on the show with us. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us in the cave. But before we go to your plugs, you also wrote a written review for this game. Where can people find that?
Yeah, so you can find that over at level1gaming.com. I have the written review up. It has a lot of the same stuff that you'll find in the video review over on YouTube, but I did flesh some areas out. So yeah, you can find it over at level1gaming.com. That's lv1gaming.com.
Yeah, and I wanted to throw that out there as well, because I know you go in that written review, you go into a little more specifics than we did here. So if people want to learn more, it's a good place to go read Matt's thoughts about that. But before we go, of course, Garrett plugs go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Blaine Explosion, and you can also find me as a co-host to the Nintendo Shack, part of the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network, where we record live Thursdays nights at twitch.tv/PSVG.
Very nice, my friend. As for Matt, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter over at burnout_Matt. You can find all of our content over at youtube.com/burnoutbrighter. We currently have a mental health series and Black History Month series going alongside our main podcast. And then, yeah, you can find us over on Level 1 Gaming as well, with more details for that coming soon.
Very nice, my friend. And for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. Don't forget, also, if you like PlayStation stuff, if you want to hear Matt and I talk every week, Matt's over there. If you want to hear Matt and I talk every week about PlayStation, head over to the PlayStation Drive. Go listen to our antics every single week. I promise you, it's a good show. And also, you can find us on YouTube, youtube.com/Yumi Capri, on Twitter at Yumi Capri's, and on podcast services around the globe. So for Matt Sowinski and Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been the extra level of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.